friends, family, enemies, and strangers of all kinds. Welcome back to the Extra Milestone, your weekly Cinemaholics spinoff, where we take a trip back to the past to visit the classic films that have made the cinematic landscape what it is today. I am your host, as always, Sam Noland, and with me I have two very special guests that I always love when I get to talk to. First up, we have the regular co-host of Cinemaholics, and I use the word regular only when it comes to frequency of appearances. This man is nothing if not unique and magnificent. It is Will Ashton. Will, how are you?
That's a very flattering opening. Thank you, Sam.
Will, I'm going to be honest. It's been a long time since we podcasted.
Yeah,
together, I just missed you.
No, I mean, I feel bad because I haven't. It's been timing both cases, but yeah, I mean, I haven't been able to come on the main ep for a little bit, or any of the side eps you've done recently. So I'm excited to be back talking Extra Milestones.
Indeed, and I'm excited to have you. But with us, we have an equally as special guest, if not more special. It is making her triumphant return for the first time in what is always far too long of a wait. It is our good friend Julia Teti. Julia, welcome back.
Thank you so much for having me back. I can't wait to talk to you guys about this movie. It's a great one.
It's a really great one. And yeah, we're just going to jump right into it. So this is the sort of the big monthly Extra Milestone episode that we do with the old gang, or at least the old gang minus John and Emily, but they could not make it for a variety of reasons. But regardless, they would want us to go on without them. And so I think that's what we're going to end up doing. We are talking about celebrating 90 years back in April, because we're a little behind, but so be it. We are talking about the Best Picture Academy Award winner, the all-time classic anti-war film, All Quiet on the Western Front. It is one of the most important films of all time. And I want to know right off the bat, let's start with you, Will Ashton. What is your connection to this movie, whether or not just hearing about it or if you've seen it in the past? What's your relationship with the Western Front and the quietness that ensues with it?
Yeah, I actually surprisingly have a very little connection to this film before seeing it. I mean, I knew the title for sure, and it was always one of those movies that was referenced with war films and anti-war films, and being such a triumphant achievement, and inspiring so many war films that come out even today. I mean, we'll probably talk about a few that it clearly inspired, but yeah, I mean, my relationship to it was not one. I didn't really have much relationship going into this.
Fair enough. Yeah, sometimes that's part of the fun, is being able to come to something for the first time. I'm excited to hear what you thought. Julia, what is your connection?
Sure. So as we were kind of discussing before we actually got onto the episode, the very first time that I watched this was about 4 years ago, when I did a project watching every single film that had ever won Best Picture. And It is the third film to ever have that honor bestowed upon it. It's probably one of my very early favorites from those first couple of years that the Academy had been created. It's such a harrowing picture. It's such a very visceral depiction of World War I. And I don't really think we talk about it as often as I feel like we should, but as Will said, it's one of those films where it's almost always referenced within kind of the contemporary landscape of war pictures and dramas, especially throughout the latter half of the 20th century and the first half of the 21st century, when we've kind of seen this revitalization within the subgenre of anti-war pictures.
Very interesting. Yeah, you're absolutely right. This is an enormously influential movie, not just on film as an art form, but all kinds of anti-war ephemera. You see everything from books to folk songs to paintings and everything in between. A lot of the imagery, a lot of the sentiment of the anti-war ethos stems directly from this movie. I have a very similar experience, not just in the reason I watched it, which was for a history project actually back in high school, but also the exact same time. I also first watched it almost exactly 4 years ago. So that is a fascinating little bit of synergy. And that's why we do the Extra Milestone. And yeah, I watched it. I remember being into it, but for whatever reason, the details just sort of floated out of my brain. And so I was delighted to get to go see it again and to discover how great it was. I just want to kind of set that out right on the bat. This movie is really magnificent, hasn't aged a day. And I know I can tell, Julia, you're on the same page. Will, I want to know, what was your reaction, just sort of your knee-jerk kind of thing, to All Quiet on the Western Front, having never seen it before?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, like you said, like I knew it was going to be good, based on the fact that it was the one of the first Best Picture winners, and then being the first film to win both director and picture. Which, I mean,
yes,
usually it doesn't happen with bad films, more or less. But
there are exceptions. But yes, generally speaking, if a movie wins Best Picture,
but I mean, obviously, there was something here that was, that struck a chord, and I figured that was going to be the case. And yeah, I mean, I think there's a couple things that might have aged, just in terms of like, there's a very old fashioned kind of like hokiness to some of the acting. I don't say that in a derogatory kind of way, just kind of more of like of its time. Just that, like, some of the younger actors have like this, I think it worked for the film, but there's like this kind of like old fashioned, like kind of like overacting almost to some of the younger performers, I think makes of its time. But as far as the sentiments and themes that are expressed in the film, it absolutely is still quite magnificent in its accomplishments. And there are just a few shots, even at the beginning of the film, just as it starts, that just like really just took me aback and impressed me. And we'll talk about those, I'm sure, in a few. But just throughout the film, I mean, I just was really impressed with what I was able to accomplish and how I was able to do so much of its time, and given the limitations that were around, because this is about like maybe like the advent of film was maybe like 20 or 30 years old at this point.
Yeah, somewhere around there, like a quarter of a century.
Yeah. So, yeah, I was definitely impressed by it for sure.
It's a really, really breathtaking production, especially having seen or having read about some of the behind the scenes. I think it's funny that you mentioned how the acting is sort of its time, but also lends the movie a sort of time capsule, yet also timeless quality. I think there are a few things about this that might seem like flaws, but in a weird way actually sort of go to make the movie better. But first, I want to know. So Julia, you had a positive reaction, of course. Might as well get it out of the way right out of the bat. Are there any things that sort of that you have like some reservations on, that you weren't quite as high on, even if it's just small little aspects of the movie?
Not particularly. I mean, Will brings up a really great point about the acting of some of the younger characters in the film, the performances. But I completely agree. I think it was definitely represents that it was of its time, but still has, as you said, a lot of timeless qualities, and why it has really stood the test of time in terms of the epicness that it creates, in terms of how director Lewis Milestone is able to create those sprawling landscapes that just never seem to end. Those action sequences are absolutely incredible. What really struck me is how the film, and I would love to hear both of your opinions on this, is how the film is able to create this really grand epic, but also have a lot of very personal introspection when it comes to the character of Paul specifically, who the audience kind of is meant to align with. And just watching these young boys, they were just a few years younger than most of us, I would say, kind of going through this harrowing experience and bearing witness to, humanity and innocence being lost incrementally throughout the film. I think it's what makes it so great.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I think there's a certain level of, I would say, universality to this. Even though it was a very specific time and place, and I think there's something very specifically about World War I that is sort of unique to this movie and this story. But even besides that, there are a few scenes in particular that I think, man, any time period, any place, anywhere, all throughout history would really benefit from having a story just like this. I want to kind of get into a few details now. To start off with, I think we should clarify, because I always forget to mention it up front. We are going to be getting into the details of the plot. I wouldn't necessarily say it's a movie that can be ruined by like finding out what happens. But as always, by all means, if you'd rather have seen it beforehand, totally your call.
Well, how do they start a war?
Well, one country offends another.
How could one country offend another? You mean there's a mountain over in Germany gets mad at a field over in France?
Yes, Mother.
Are you wounded?
No, Mother, I got leave.
Here I lie and cry instead of being glad.
I'll take these off, Mother.
You're a soldier now, aren't you?
How's it at home? Have a good leave?
In spots.
What's the matter?
Oh, I'm no good for back there anymore, Cat. None of us are. We've been in this too long. The young men thought I was a coward because I told them that we learned that death is stronger than duty one's country. The old men said, go on, push on to Paris. My father even wanted me to wear my uniform around.
So the movie starts, it is in Germany. And I think one thing I want to make clear right away is that has kind of weirded me out both times, but this time I saw actually a certain interesting layer to this. They're German characters, and yet they're all speaking English. And this is an American movie. I think partly it's just because they didn't really see the need to like get actors who could speak German and stuff, because it would have been kind of off-putting, just that language barrier, and also the idea of eliciting sympathy for this side that had lost the war and at the time was sort of rising in power around the world in a very, as we know now, very insidious, evil way. But also I think what it does is it does allow audiences to sort of connect to those characters, American audiences, at least I should specify. This is an American movie. And I think it's very interesting to see just within seconds how it's building that layer of that thin layer between the screen and the viewer. So we start off, and there is a professor played by, I have the actor written down here, actor named Arnold Lucy, this very impassioned professor who's totally gung-ho about the war. It is World War One, if we didn't specify already, and is just saying like, you have to be soldiers and you have to fight for what he calls the fatherland. So very patriarchal right off the bat. And you see, as you mentioned, Julia, all these kids sitting there, like they're like around my age, probably, maybe even younger, and just completely enthralled by this. Like, yeah, we're going to go fight in the war, of course, having no idea how horrific it is and everything. And so it just sets this tone right off the bat of how the war sort of infects the young mind, especially this war in particular. I want to know, Will, at this point, what, like, so you mentioned, I just kind of want to get a line on this. You mentioned that you knew, like, that the movie existed and the title and everything and the basic story. I realize that sounds funny as I say it, but yeah. But at this point, so what are you thinking at this point? Like, okay, so we're just getting into it. This is going to be, were you thinking this was going to be like a really thrilling war picture, or what was your line of thought?
No, I mean, I knew to a certain extent that wasn't a glorification of war, but I didn't know to like what extent they could accomplish that. Like, I mean, like you said, like, I mean, it's, I guess, kind of pre-code, right? But
yeah, this is 1930, so it was before the Hays Code, the production code, which is rather notorious by modern standards. Before that was really heavily enforced. So there's actually a lot of really gruesome stuff that even 5 years later, they would not have been able to get away with.
Yeah, right. So, but I knew, like, of the time, like, it's not going to be Saving Private Ryan. Like, it's not going to be like this entirely visceral, but I didn't know it was going to be quite as intensive as it is. But I think it's for the better for sure. But I mean, I think the thing that most struck me, like the moment I knew that it was really going to be something impactful, was the scene I think you're referring to, is where that opening shot where like the camera is like showing the crowd, and it kind of like the sound of it so overwhelmingly kind of echoes into the classroom, and like to the point where it's just like there's kind of like reverberating throughout, like the sentiment of like, you know, like you got to fight. Like, this is like what the homeland is about. Like, this is who you have to be. And like, you know, like seeing like this almost like kind of like PSA look at these like, this adoration of like kids, like seeing the war and stuff like that. And I knew from that point, it was going to be something special, I think. But I think it mostly met like what my expectations were. I mean, it was just maybe more graphic than I anticipated at the time. But I mean, for me, I like that. Like, I was afraid I was going to be almost like a little bit like sanitized in a way that would make it feel dated, but I didn't get that sense from it.
Yeah, that would be like kind of hard to take as seriously as you might want to. That's very interesting you say that. Yeah, it's almost like this irresistible calling that they're experiencing of this thing that they have no idea about. Now, we mentioned that this is a rather famously an anti-war film. It is based on a 1929 novel by writer Eric Maria Remarque, as our quick bit of research shows. And it's it's always comes up when the topic of war movies or anti-war movies, which are sometimes the same thing, always comes up. I think this is definitely one of the most successful, though, in the way that it portrays combat. Now, I want to know from you, Julia Teti. I've never really gotten a line. What is sort of like? I know it's a broad question to ask, but just generally speaking, what is sort of your line on the war genre? Like, are you typically a fan of it, or is it not really your thing, or something in between?
Oh, I wouldn't necessarily say that I'm a fan exactly. I've always been a casual viewer of it, I guess. But I would say there's never really a particular film or picture that I feel particularly attached to or what have you. I've definitely paid attention a little bit more as I've gotten older to the differentiation between films that kind of have this glorification or romanticization of war efforts and experiences and stories versus a lot of different pictures like All Quiet on the Western Front, which really depict this anti-war fervor without even really knowing it, or kind of having this very subtle cue of reminding the audience the absolute tragedy and devastation that comes with being a part of something so globally horrific as World War I, for example, which is what All Quiet on the Western Front depicts.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I really want to get into that what you just mentioned, which is how it is a World War I movie. It is sort of this global war that took place on sort of a enormous scale. That's actually kind of hard to comprehend compared to a lot of other wars. And I think that is part of what makes this so effective as a movie that is just damning of all combat, because there's this conversation that's had sort of midway through the movie between a couple of the soldiers, I should say, where they just bring up like, who started this war? And none of them can really figure it out. They're like, well, one country got mad at another country for like, some archduke was assassinated, and that caused a rumble. And now because of that problem that these people are having, we have to give our lives, and we have to have our lives ruined forever. And isn't that exciting? And they're all like, no, not really. But we just kind of have to live with it. There's something about World War I that is just so effective in that way. Yes, Julia.
Yeah, I would even say that, the scene that you're bringing up is really, really vital, I think, to the entire messaging of the film. And it comes right after one of the best sequences I think that the film has. One of the most devastating that it has visually, especially. But I also would like to say, they don't even, in the way that they're talking about the war, they don't even get to talking about the assassination of the Duke. They're just kind of milling about saying, well, one country offends another. And, one of the characters, I think it might be Albert, who's one of the older gentlemen within the soldier revelry, says, well, what happens? Does a mountain get angry at a field? And does a German mountain get angry at a field in France? It's a great line. And so one of the younger men says, a group of people from one country offend another group of people from another country. And Albert says, well, I'm not offended, so why am I here? And it's just I think it's just such a really bold statement about especially these young men, especially during that time when, communication wasn't the same that it is today. And, having the ability to have access to so many details and think pieces and various opinions on what is happening within the realm of the world, it just was not available. So to have these young men having this discussion and just kind of understanding from the perspective of the audience that these are just pawns who don't even know why they're being moved around the chessboard. They're just being pushed here and there.
Yeah, they don't know, and they don't have the capacity to care. It's been sort of exploded out of them viscerally by all this combat that we see. And indeed, the combat in this movie is sort of one of a kind. It's a lot of war movies, even some of the great ones, even some of my favorite ones, like Apocalypse Now, for instance. That is a movie that depicts combat in a really brutal way, but also in like a really cinematically dynamic, exciting way, a way that's like fun to watch. And I think All Quiet on the Western Front is unique in that it's not, I wouldn't say it's unfun to watch, but the brutality of it is sort of at the forefront of the filmmakers. You can tell very clearly that is what they really want to highlight. And it comes across, there's a lot of really, really brutal stuff in this movie. It just everything from the trenches, which were very authentically recreated, to the point where like sanitation workers were suspicious. Like, is this safe for the actors? Apparently it was, but it was that good that that question had to be brought up. And yeah, just seeing the toll it takes on them over time is really effective. Will, it's been a while since we've heard from you. I want to know what is maybe a scene or an aspect of this movie, either that we brought up or we haven't, that really leaps out to you as you think back to seeing the movie.
I mean, there are quite a few. Like I said, I mean, I'm kind of struck between both sides of the film, which are that, like I said, like there's a visceral aspect of the war scenes, which are able to be like pretty graphic and violent, like that guy running in the barbed wire and like losing his eyes. And I was wondering if like that was the origin of like when you always see like those like memes like my eyes, like from like SpongeBob and stuff. Like I didn't know if that was like dated back to that or not, or if that was just me being my brain being weird. But
I wouldn't be surprised.
But yeah, I mean, like there's like that stuff obviously stands out. But like you said, like I think the scenes that really resonate with me, and I think that make the movie work, are like the authentic sort of like camaraderie that's seen between the guys. And like even when there's like kind of like these more like kind of melodramatic touches, like there's a sincerity to the characters and the performances and the writing that I really admired, especially like that scene you were talking about where it's just the group of them kind of like just like, you know, like kind of like having beans and you know, discussing like, well, who started what, and it just like there's this idea of like in the end it doesn't really matter, but like in a sense like it does bring them closer, even if it does like, you know, kind of lead to their downfall. There's like this really kind of like a nice quality to that's kind of melancholy too, that I think that's what really stands out to me watching it.
Yeah. The camaraderie is very infectious, I would say. But you realize after a while, it's really all they have. I think I'm not going to give away the ending right now, but you see by the time this movie concludes that death is kind of the only thing that awaits the life of a soldier. And whether that's actual literal death, it's the only certainty, yeah, in life in general, but especially in war, it's all the more dramatic as depicted in this movie. Whether it's actually on the battlefield in the midst of, you know, some heated conflict, or even just the how should I say, the sort of psychological toll, the loss of the soul, you might say, that takes place in veterans from across the ages. And I think that's something very effective. Julia, I want to know, I'm just going to come right out and say it. There are practically no women in this movie. And that is not inconsistent with other war movies of the kind, but
or even like recent ones like Dunkirk.
Yeah, or 1917. I thought of
that's
a lot.
True, yeah. Mm-hmm.
But I wanted to know how, if at all, I should say, were you able to connect to these soldiers just sort of as people, regardless of like who they were or how they acted and stuff?
Well, I mean, you know, it's a film of a specific time period where that kind of that lack of representation is kind of part and parcel to it. I kind of get really tired of the question and the debate of, well, there are no women in these war movies. And it's, there are stories about women enduring the toll of war just as the same as there are about men, but from a very different perspective and from a very different front. But I think just going back to this, it's a story about people being thrust into the dregs of humanity and having to survive. You were bringing up the only certainty within this film is death. And I would even go as far to say that, number one, death is one of the biggest characters that plays a role in the film. And number two, it's, I think, the primary adversary that a lot of the characters are facing. It doesn't really matter who their enemy is, who their opponent is. It just all has to do with survival. There are a lot of moments, I think, too, that could possibly lend themselves to this very survivalist horror kind of quasi genre that there are split seconds of throughout the film. But yeah, I get kind of tired of the question of, there aren't women in this film, how can women connect to it? It's still a very well-made, well-constructed film about a time period where it's part and parcel that men were sent, and there are stories of women that we just have yet to see, that have yet to be depicted, of them fighting a very different war.
Yeah, that's totally fair enough. I totally get what you're saying. If my question came off as trite or
no, it definitely did. But it's a question that's consistently brought up, and I think that there's this conversation of, if there isn't enough representation, that must be not accurate enough. And there are really great anachronistic depictions of history where we do see representation from different races and genders and sexualities and what have you. But again, this movie was made in 1930. It wasn't something that was even thought of. It's still today, I think, in terms of accuracy, filmmakers in general try to stay as close as they can to creating something that felt as accurate as possible, instead of trying to push boundaries, which there are certainly filmmakers who do that, I think, more often today than there were.
Yeah, naturally. But it's sort of just the evolution of art. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I was gonna say, I don't want to speak over Julia, but it's I think, like with anything, like there's not really any broad spectrum of like race depicted in this film, or like, it's just like, I think like what Julia's saying is true. It's just that you can recognize that, like, as cinema, as we look back on it, it is flawed in terms of representation, but you can't really entirely say like something is like negative because representation is there. It's a tricky balance, I do think, but I do think what Julia says is very apt and poignant right there.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I think part of the reason why I brought it up is because there's this quick sequence where they're in France. It's sort of a low period, and I don't want to get hung up on this or anything, but where they just sort of gleefully sort of lust after these French women and just have sort of an exciting time while they can, pretty much. So I was just curious if that came off as any semblance of how should we say, insensitive or anything, but it sounds to me like it's not especially.
I don't think so, especially because, I have the previous knowledge of having taken some French when I was in school, so I was able to pick up some of the language too. And I think that the one thing that stood out to me, especially in that scene, was that Suzanne, the young woman that Paul spends the evening with, the thing that she keeps saying over and over again is poor boy. And it just brings you right back into the fact that these are just kids who are just trying to survive. And this is one night where they get to actually have some semblance of, if you want to call it normalcy or just human interaction. It just brings you back to that whole idea that these poor boys, just nothing good awaits them as soon as they walk out of that door.
Yeah. I think that's very fascinating. I actually hadn't picked up on that translation, so that's fascinating to learn about. And I think that ties right into another sequence I'd like to talk about, unless, Will, you had anything you wanted to mention about this scene in particular. But
Not especially. I think there's a lot to discuss here. I don't want to keep it just on this, but I
Cool.
do think there's I'm excited to see where we go from here.
Cool. Yeah, just making sure. So there is a scene later on. A lot of war has happened. There's been death. There's been horrific, just some of the most horrific stuff you can imagine. And we haven't even brought up just how horrifying, or I guess we sort of have, but we haven't gotten into detail about how just how horrifying a lot of this trench warfare we see depicted is, where they're just sort of trapped underground as the very ceiling is caving in on them. It's really effective, and the violence and the visceral nature of it is only one small piece of the puzzle, but a very important one regardless. And after a lot of that happens, we see Paul, the main character, played by Lou Ayres, if we haven't said that yet. We see him get a little bit of a leave of absence. It's like a week or 5 days or something like that. Goes back to his hometown, home village, perhaps, in Germany. And we see him just have no idea what to do. Like, life seems so kind of meaningless there, to the point where he even goes back to the very school or classroom or whatever it is, where that we see that speech given in the first scene of the movie, and see all these other kids who I think are specifically designed to look really young. So it's a really powerful sort of juxtaposition they give, with this character that's more or less the same age and yet looks so much wearier than them, and see him just be like, yeah, it's war and we fight and that's it. There's nothing fulfilling about it. There's no real purpose to it that we can discern. We have no idea what difference we're making, if any. And the professor is really frustrated about this. Like, yes, but it's thrilling, isn't it? And it's exciting to get to fight for the fatherland. And Paul's like, sort of, not especially. I want to know, is this? I want to hear from you, Julia. Is that how did that scene speak to you? Was it just sort of compounding on the tragedy, or how did you think?
Yeah, I think that it really reaffirms the true horror, the terror, and everything, the toll that it really takes on the young boys at the beginning of the film who go off to be sent to the front because there's this romanticized, nationalistic view of what they will be doing and how they will be helping, when one after the other, they're just killed in these brutal fashions. And it's interesting that you bring up that scene, because prior to it, there's a scene where Paul is sitting with his father and two of his father's friends. And all three of the older gentlemen are trying to explain to Paul basically what he has to do and how what the soldiers have to do in order to, quote unquote, win the war, basically. And they just continue on. And Paul, I think, even says something to the effect of, it's a lot different when you're really there. You think that, you can call these kinds of shots, but it's completely different when you're in those trenches, when you're on that battlefield. And that kind of just goes over the men's heads, and they continue to talk about it. It just really validated this sort of the other side of the story that we don't really see of everyone at home, and how much this fuels this nationalistic energy that we all know, due to history, has continued on in Germany, especially. I think that it's a really fascinating scene that really just drives home this very brutal life that the young men have to experience in the short time that they experience it, feeling like they're doing something great when they know themselves it's not at all that romanticized story that they were once told sitting in those very chairs in that schoolroom.
Yeah, I think that's a very effective scene where he sort of just gets fed up with it and is like, I can learn nothing from this. You don't know anything. And I think he kind of looks at those three characters in that tavern that you were just mentioning the same way he looks at that professor, like, who clearly has not actually been to the war, or at least not to the same extent that Paul or any of his fellow soldiers have. They just have no concept of what it actually is like. And I think this movie, that's kind of that. If there is a mission statement of this movie, it's depicting that as much as possible, just how completely frivolous, just how completely arbitrary war really is at the end of the day, and everything from that scene we just discussed to the earlier scene where they're talking about who started the war and everything. I think that's really fascinating. I think it's at this point I want to get a little bit into sort of the national side of this movie, or international, or whatever phrase you want to use. This is the Germans, and this is before the Nazi Party really rose and started to take over, but they were certainly out there. And in fact, the Nazi Party really hated this movie. They thought it was like anti-German and made them look weak. And if the Nazis hated it, I'm going to say that's a good sign that this is actually something really powerful. And to the point where after they started rising to power, they outlawed this movie from 1933 to sources differ, but somewhere in the mid 60s, like around or 50s, I should say, like 1956 is when this movie was outlawed. So they really did not want the world to see this. And I mean, it just got me to thinking, like, imagine if that had not been outlawed, like would World War II have turned out as differently? I mean, I know it's a lot of meaning to heap onto this movie, but you just wonder if it could have had an impact. So that's really fascinating. And I want to know, Will, I want to hear from you first. Do you think, like, how is, just your estimation? I know we'll never know for sure, but how do you think this movie plays differently now in 2020, or even just the 21st century in general, as compared to when it first was released in 1930? Like, obviously, there's been some history since then.
I think, like anything, looking back on film, there's something that's like kind of quaint about it. And I don't really mean that in a derogatory kind of way, just kind of looking at it as like a product of its time. Like, there was something that was, like if we're looking at this film as like one of the very first like films to really depict the terrors and the horrors and the sustaining trauma of war, like this film, like considering like how the genre has evolved, there is something that, even if it is fairly brutal, it is, it's not like fully like exploring the like every like terror and like that, not like doing anything as extreme as other films. So I think if you were to like watch this film and then like Black Hawk Down like back to back, you would be like, oh, okay, yeah, this is kind of not quite as hitting, but not to say that isn't as effective. It's just that I think in that sense, I guess if that might answer your question. But like if you were to look at it maybe as like compared to something like, I guess like you're saying, like maybe Dunkirk or 1917, I think those films, like, well, maybe more so 1917, like there's like this like temptation to almost kind of like be nostalgic, or like maybe even like verge on romanticizing, because like the camera work and like so much of the filmmaking is first and foremost in it, that there's like that danger of doing that. And I think this film being such an early film and being such a like trendsetter, I think it mostly avoids that. And you can, I mean, maybe you two disagree, but yeah, I don't know. I mean, I guess those are some things that stand out to me. Like, I think something I really admire about this film as opposed to 1917 is that while I think that film works, I think like the filmmaking almost kind of makes like an artifice at times of the war. Like, I think there's some key scenes in there that are really effective and I really like, but like, because the style is so first and foremost, like I get the sense that like, I don't really get the full scope of the war. And I know that goes against some reviews of that film, but that's how I remember feeling afterwards. But I never really got that sense, like even like beyond like the kind of like old fashioned, like kind of like verging on hokey acting of this. Like, I think all that is done in a fairly effective and hard hitting way. And I didn't really get that as much with 1917. So I guess in that sense, I would say for the most part, it really does hold up quite well in modern lens.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I was thinking a lot about 1917 too, partly because it's recent, but it is also World War One. And that movie is 1917. That movie takes a very reverent approach to sort of the soldier's experience. It makes it look like it could be really exciting with a lot of the, sort of the video game storytelling tactics that it's used. By the way, I love 1917, but this is just the way if we're contrasting the two movies. There's a way to look at the movie 1917 and think that it is on the verge, if not well in the midst of propaganda when it comes to just showing the experience of war as something really exciting and really worthwhile and noble to do. Whereas this movie, All Quiet on the Western Front, it might be that very thing that you mentioned, which is the cinematography. Arthur Edison was the cinematographer for All Quiet on the Western Front. Oscar nominated, didn't win, sadly. It's very matter of fact. There's not a lot of incredibly exciting swooping shots across the battlefield and like slow motion Terrence Malick, Thin Red Line kind of stuff. That's something that really stood out to me, is just how sort of cold and stark it is. It also helps that there is no soundtrack, so that might be part of it. We've talked a lot about the sort of the anti-war leanings on this movie, but Julia, I want to know, just if you had to really kind of sum it up, what would you say is maybe one thing or a couple things about All Quiet on the Western Front that sets it apart from other war movies when it comes to denouncing the idea of combat in this kind?
I think you used a really great term when you were just speaking just now, and it's a very cold film. It really puts that space in between the audience and the characters and the story, that this is something very cruel. It's something that's very tragic that happens within, each person's lifetime. We have to experience something to this gravity. I also want to bring up the point that you made of the lack of soundtrack. I think really helps the film way more than it hinders it. I think that soundtracks, more often than not, and beautiful orchestrations really add to that kind of sweeping, romantic, heroic disposition that we get from a lot of war movies. But the lack of that within All Quiet on the Western Front makes it just feel so insular, and yet also so epic and grand and so sprawling. And I think more than anything, what it demonstrates is the real toll in terms of the mental toll, the physical toll very much so, and the toll on lives and loss of innocence and humanity that is really taken out on the young men that are put into that position.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. What's the phrase I'm looking for? It has no illusions about
absolutely not.
Just kind of the real nonsense of it all. And we've seen I mentioned this again. We've seen this throughout history, how it's just all of it is just so fraught with nonsense when it comes to wars throughout the ages. There's one other scene a little bit towards the end I want to touch on specifically, but first I want to know, Will, I'll ask you first. Are there any other scenes that we haven't mentioned yet, or any other sequences, line of dialogue, aspects of the movie, what have you, that you want to make sure that we get to bring up?
Well, the one thing that I don't think we really talked about that I was really taken by was, I don't know his name, but the sergeant kind of actor, the guy with the kind of weird nose.
Yes, that is Kaczynski, played by Louis Woolheim.
Yeah, I just love everything about this performance. Just the brashness of it, the kind of like the chutzpah of it, and also just the look of his character is just especially at this time, there's something about it that is just kind of odd, and it's instinctive in a way that I never doubt for a second that this guy has lived a life, that has seen things, and that his viewpoint is so much about what kind of paints the film and informs a lot of the film away from the younger actors. And I think in a lot of sense, he kind of ties it all together in a way that I think is worth championing and celebrating. I was just all about this performance.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I was reading up on this actor a little bit. And yeah, he had a very long, extensive career throughout the silent era. And this was actually something of not necessarily a breakout role, but a role that really got him noticed by a lot of studios. They're like, oh, wow, that guy could be a really great character actor. And it's it's really tragic to say this, but he tragically died less than a year after All Quiet on the Western Front, completely out of nowhere. Like, it was really unexpected. So who knows what great performances and characters we might have gotten. But yeah, this one that we got is fantastic regardless. Julia, I want to know, is there anything else that you want to touch on?
I think that we covered a lot and had a lot of really great conversation about this film. I just think that it's so interesting to see in 1930, especially pre-World War II time, this fervor of anti-war messaging in this over 2-hour epic. And then it's fascinating also to see kind of it's how it influenced so many films afterwards. I mean, one of my favorite post-World War II films, I think you might have talked about actually on the Extra Milestone, is The Best Years of Our Lives.
We haven't gotten to that one, actually. I think that's 46, somewhere around there.
Yeah.
So that'll be next year.
Yeah, it's one of my favorite post-World War II films, and also in its own it's a lot more intimate. It's all post-World War II, coming from, these families who have these men in their lives who are adjusting back to civilian life. And it too, it really hits home for a lot of, the real toll that it takes on the young men who were sent over and over again and asked so much, and knew very little, as we saw in All Quiet on the Western Front. There's always this lingering question of, why us? Why now? What happened to make this occur? I think that it's a really great film that I think has stood the test of time and has really influenced a lot of further anti-war pictures, whether it's Dunkirk or The Hurt Locker or Saving Private Ryan, especially, which kind of teeters on both heroicism and romanticization, as well as being incredibly graphic and really hitting on the reason why war is such a devastating and horrific event. And it's all just, we can all sit back and watch it as cinema and just as a depiction without having to really come to terms with the true gruesomeness and seeing that over and over again, as so many men have borne witness to over the years. I just think it's such a great film. It's one of my favorite early Oscar winners. And I would completely recommend it to any of your dedicated listeners to really check it out and invest some time into it. I think it's just a staggering picture, both in its visual language as well as the introspection that it gives the young men on screen.
Yeah, that's really great to hear. I love what you mentioned, that little phrase, just from the soldier's perspective of why us. And as we see time and time again in this movie and elsewhere, there's no real reason why. There's no reason why any of this had to happen or why you had to go through it. It's just what we've got, and it sucks, and it really sucks. I think I speak for all three of us when I say we've never fought in a war. But just if it's anything like the experience I've seen throughout various mediums, it's really horrific. And I think this movie is one of the definitive works of art when it comes to exploring that. And I think there is it's not even a whole scene. It's just one part of a scene really late in the movie that I think kind of encapsulates the entire thing. It is when it's after Paul comes back from his leave, rather frustratedly, like he just said, I can't stand it here. I got to get back to the battlefield. That's all I know now. Heads back to the front and sees Kaczynski, who we just brought up. And they're like, hey, it's good to see you again. They start running across the field to like embrace each other. And then like when they're almost halfway across the field, they're like, oh, and they duck and a bomb lands right near them. And they think nothing of it. And they just get right back up and keep going. Like that's how desensitized they've been to it through no fault of their own whatsoever. And that just one little moment really got to me. There are a couple of things we didn't get to that I just want to mention, just little fun facts I found about the movie. When it came to authenticity, Lewis Milestone, the director, was really adamant about making sure that everything looked accurate, wanted to get it sort of authenticated by actual veterans, German veterans, if he could. So he did a little.
That Milestone was extra.
I was
trying to figure out a way to do that joke. I apologize.
There was a pause after you said, "Are you saying?" I'm like, "Oh, Will's gonna have a great one." Yeah, I would say Milestone was very extra in this case. Has been for 90 years now. But anyway, yeah, he did a little bit of research and found out, are there any veterans living in Los Angeles that I can get in contact with? Turns out there were literally thousands, like something in the ballpark of 2,000 veterans of World War I were living there. And he actually decided, well, hell, I'll let them be extras in the movie, assuming that won't be traumatizing or triggering in any way. And so there are actually a lot of veterans in this movie as extras and bit characters.
Milestones
One
extras.
of them, Milestones extras. You never disappoint, Will. One of them, I was fascinated to find out, is future director Fred Zinnemann, who directed High Noon and a few other movies that I can't remember. Julia is one of them, and Man for All Seasons. That was really fascinating to find out. And we haven't brought it up because it's not a huge important part of the movie or anything, but this is 1930. It did go into production shortly after the big stock market crash that started the Great Depression. And the fact that this is a big budget movie, you can tell just by watching it and seeing compared to other movies of the era. It was not a cheap movie. And so the fact that the studio, Universal, they decided to go ahead with it, that was a huge gamble, and it really paid off. It was a success in many ways. It was critically acclaimed from many circles, except the Nazis, but it's not like they count. And as we mentioned before, won the 3rd Academy Award for Best Picture. I believe at the time it was called Outstanding Production, which is a much loftier title that I do not disapprove of, but Best Picture is just as good as far as I'm concerned. And also won Louis Milestone his 2nd Academy Award for Best Director. He'd won his first for 2 Arabian Nights at the first Academy Award. So this makes him the first 2-time winner. And this was fascinating to me because a lot of movies that we talked about, especially some of the older ones, have lapsed into the public domain. As it turns out, All Quiet on the Western Front is such a big deal. It does not go into the public domain until 2026. So you do have to pay to see it. It's not available on the Internet Archive or anything. But it's well worth it. Yeah.
I was going to say, I mean, I saw it. I don't know how you two saw it, but it's available for free right now on the streaming service Peacock for free.
Oh, no kidding. Good to know.
Yeah. That's how, I don't know how you two saw it, but if you want to check it out after this conversation or before this conversation, it's there. All you have to do is just sign up, but you don't need to have a subscription or anything. It's free right now.
Good to know. Okay. So take it from Will. Is it available on Peacock? I've actually never heard of that streaming service.
Just came out this week. That's why it was very convenient.
Did it really?
Yeah.
Oh, that's funny.
Like literally 2 days ago, I think.
They have All Quiet on the Western Front, so that works out nicely for them. We've talked about a lot. I think I have one final question, and Julia, when you mentioned the best years of our lives, this led me to believe there are obviously lots and lots of war movies all throughout the ages. I want to know if you had to make like if you wanted to recommend a double feature to do with All Quiet on the Western Front. I know I'm kind of putting you two on the spot, but is there one specific movie that you would say really complements it? And Julia, I'll start with you. Would you go with Best Years of Our Lives, or is there something else?
Oh, I think to kind of give some space, but also have a film that also depicts the brutality in very graphic nature. I think Platoon would be a really interesting second film to watch alongside All Quiet on the Western Front. That also has a lot more of the sweeping musical moments that kind of, I wouldn't say it romanticizes it. I think it's one of the more brutal war depictions of war, especially the Vietnam War that we have seen. And I would definitely, I think that's also a film that I haven't revisited since I watched it, because it's a very, very intense film, does not hold back. But I would say something along those lines. Platoon would probably be a very interesting watch alongside All Quiet on the Western Front.
That's a very good choice. I had not even thought about that. I love that. Will, does something leap to mind when it comes to pairing something with All Quiet on the Western Front?
The first one that came to mind was Pass the Glory, I guess.
Yeah.
Not for any particular reason. Like maybe just because they're both black and white. But
they're both World War I, and they're both very anti-combat.
Yeah. I guess more recently though, the Peter Jackson documentary, the They Shall Not Grow Old. Restored a lot of World War I footage
with the restored imagery. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, especially with this film, I was going to bring this up as well. I don't know if you guys or if you two know the answer or not, but so the original cut of this film, I guess, was like 152 minutes long, and then this restored one is about 133 minutes. So I guess somewhere around the lines of like 50 or so minutes got lost in time. I don't know if you two know what was lost, or if anyone really knows what exactly was the difference between the original cut and this one.
I actually do happen to know that. I thank you for bringing that up. I completely forgot to bring that up. So All Quiet on the Western Front, when it was filmed, they filmed it with two different cameras right next to each other. And the idea was one camera was for the sound version, and the other was going to be the same movie, but silent. They would not have a synchronized audio track. And the idea was that was the one they would send to other countries so that they could also see it as well. And so actually that 152-minute cut is the version that went out around the world to non-English speaking countries. And so the extra 20 or so minutes, that's all intertitles. As far as I can tell, there may have been like a scene or two that's been lost along the way, but that is actually mostly just the time taken to display the dialogue on the screen. So thank you so much for bringing that up.
Yeah, no, I mean, I was just curious because I was just curious because I just didn't know. Because I initially was like looking for like the 152-minute version. Like I was thinking I was going to be missing something, and then like I was just doing a quick Wikipedia search. I'm like, oh, okay, this is like the actual, like this is the version we've got right now. So I'm not missing anything too I mean, as far as I know, we're not missing anything too crucial, but it was just something that stuck out to me. I was curious about what the difference was there, but that's good to know.
Absolutely. Yeah. If you see the version that's available on a variety of streaming service, you're seeing the movie, or you're really not missing anything. Will, you actually took my double feature. I was also going to say Paths of Glory. That is one of my very favorite movies, early Stanley Kubrick movie. Utterly fantastic. But I have another one, and this is kind of, for those who have seen it, it's kind of the holy grail when it comes to absolutely horrific, brutal, almost unwatchable, to the point where it's been over half a decade since I've seen it, and I have not had the guts to go back, so to speak. It is Elim Klimov's Come and See. I don't know if either of you have ever heard of this movie. Just got a Criterion release.
Yeah, I've been wanting to see this one very much since I've been hearing about it a lot recently.
It will destroy you. Have you seen Come and See, Julia?
I have not. I think that it's been getting a lot of comparisons to a film that recently came out, though, and I'm losing the title is escaping my mind. But it too is a black and white film that, from what I have read, is absolutely devastating. So continue to talk. I'll look up the name of that film while we're speaking.
Yeah, Come and See is a movie about World War II, a kid who gets just abducted completely out of the blue into the Russian war, sort of this little insurgent group. And it is some of the most horrific war imagery you will ever see. It is devastating, and I would be amazed if I ever have the courage to go back to it.
The film that I was trying to look up, excuse the interjection, but the film that has been getting comparisons to is The Painted Bird, which I believe has recently been released, or some of our colleague critics have had the opportunity to review it.
Yeah, I heard that's brutal.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I'm very curious. I'm very curious and I guess trepidatious, I guess, to watch that film from what I've heard. I don't know what you've heard, Julia, but it sounds pretty intense for sure.
Oh, absolutely.
I'm gonna have to keep an eye out for that one. Thank you for letting me know that. And yeah, I think with that, I think that is our conversation. Will, Julia, thank you so much for joining me on this month's big epic Extra Milestone. I had a ton of fun. I hope you did as well.
Oh, thank you so much.
Absolutely.
Cool. Yeah. Let's do the rounds. Julia, where can the listeners find you online if they are so inclined, and they should be?
So you can see some of my previous bylines here at Cinemaholics. You can also check me out at Film School Rejects, Polygon, Girls on Tops, and The Playlist, among others.
Fascinating. Listeners, do yourself a favor and look into the works of Julia Teti. You will not be disappointed. Will, where can they find you besides on Cinemaholics every single week? Where can you be found on the interwebs?
Yeah, I mean, cinemaholics.com for sure, and then I write for Cinema Blend. If you want to check out my daily rating, that's where you can find it.
Awesome. And I am on Letterboxd as always, and of course, I host this show every week, so never fear, I'm never more than 7 days away. And I think that just about does it for our show, so we will sign off, as we always do. From the Internet, Colorado, I am Sam Noland.
From the Internet, Pennsylvania, I'm Will Ashton.
From the Internet, where it's all quiet on the Western Front, I'm Julia Teti.
Very nice, very nice. And we will see you on the next Extra Milestone.